For both? Okay. I'm Neta from the law school here, and I'm happy to moderate, to chair this session. We have two papers, two presenters, and two commentators. I will tell you about them in a minute. Then each one of them will talk for about 20 minutes, comment for about 10 minutes. We'll open for discussion, and then we'll go ahead with the next session. Even though we kind of started a bit late, we'll try to finish by 1 o'clock. So we do have, I think, enough time. So our first presenter is Haim Hazan. Haim Hazan is a professor of sociology and social anthropology. His main areas of interest and research cover the life course, time, cultural and interactional aspects of old age, total institutions, community, nationalism, and collective memory. He is also the co-director of the Minerva Center for Interdisciplinary Study of the End of Life and a senior fellow at the Safra Center for Ethics, which is hosting us here. Dr. Ari Shik will comment on Haim Hazan's presentation. Ari Shik is a postdoc fellow at the Safra Center for Ethics here at Tel Aviv University. He completed his PhD in philosophy, specialized in moral philosophy and bioethics at Michigan State University in 2014, and been involved in bioethics for a while, for over a decade, working at Hastings. Prior to his doctoral studies, he worked at the Newly Center at Yeshiva University and conducted research on a book on third-party assisted reproduction with the late Adrian Ash, who again wrote a lot on disability, and I would always like to mention Adrian wherever I can. Our second presenter is Professor George Kushp. George Kushp is a philosopher from the University of South Carolina. His research includes bioethics, philosophy of medicine, philosophy and ethics, and emerging science and technology. And Professor David Head will comment. David is the chairman, he's the Chaim Perlman Chair in Philosophy at Hebrew University, and his main interests are ethical theory, political philosophy, bioethics, and a senior fellow at the Safra Center here as well. So we will start. I do have my 5-minute, 1-minute notes ready. And I'm known to be nice but tough. So we will start.
Do you want to sit up front?
Yeah, I think, are you sure? Yeah, I think it's better, especially if we have people who want to see us as well as hear us. You could actually do this trick. Works? It works?
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Not at my expense, is it?
No. Time is not running yet.
You can put it on the table, it's fine.
Right. Good morning. This is In Defense of Pain. And I hope that with the completion of this talk, you will be stabbing each other in the stomach, not in the back. Well, the barbarism of pain seizes reason, sense, and sensibility. It reverts consciousness to its pristine state of monolithic existence that muffles reflexivity and reorients temporality. As such, it defies rational reasoning, subverts binary opposition of body and mind, and undermines the security of retention and intention instilled in the social. The agonized human is left alone in the enduring throes of the intractable totality of pain. The following series of wonderments might highlight the dissociation between that experience of pain and the emergence of the social. Why is it considered shamefully undignified to express pain in public? Why is it that in our modern culture, unleashed demonstration of gripping pain calls for the instant administration of a regime of palliation. What is the common denominator of the introduction of painless methods of execution, the proliferation of the pharmaceutical industry of analgesic drugs, the widespread resorting to epidural during labor, and the rise of the hospice movement? Why is the Swiss organization that arranges for pain-free death for the terminally ill called Dignitas? The answer to all these seemingly divergent issues lie in the inverse relations that exists in the discourse of modernity between the constructed social and the seemingly primordial visceral, between dignity and pain, and ultimately between the inclusionary practices that circumscribe contemporary culture and the exclusionary codes that chart apparent extra-cultural zones of prohibited exception. I wish to argue that following the work of sociologist Norbert Elias, particularly his influential work, The Loneliness of the Dying, pain is conceived of as such an extra-cultural force, a non-hybrid that challenges the modern vision of disciplining and modifying nature. Pain thus presents itself as an unbridled barbarian, wreaking havoc in the safe domain of civilized order, while shattering the present fantasy of biopolitical surveillance. Ineffable pain, therefore, might forebode a return to a bodily-centered monistic culture that does away with both dualism and holism of matter, mind, and social milieu, nature and nurture. This is a state already lurking in emergent current lifestyles of cherished corporeality and celebrated materiality, such as body cults and culinary fads. Still, this consumerist slant is deemed a digression from the ethos of hyphenated and transient identities that prevails in a global area, and consequently it poses a threat to the dynamic of fusing and diffusing bits and bytes of selfhood. Pursuant to that is the proposition that unlike in a dualistic culture of sanctified martyrdom, where personal torment is transcended into ritualistic performances of collective suffering, self-indulgence in pain is normatively condemned as an antisocial act committed by excommunicated, undignified, stigmatized so-called deviants. Thus, expressed pleasurable pain, such as masochism, would be tabooed as a form of perversion. In other words, pain per se is conceived of as an outlandish invader, an ultimate other, to be eliminated or banished from the land of dignified civility, where the imagery and the practice of the social reign supreme. Following that, metaphorically embellished pains and aches of the heart are deemed subjected to the ameliorating effects of the thriving and complex apparatus of modern therapeutic culture that identifies self-respect with self-control. Hence, in modern secular society, there is an intention and pretension to prevent all suffering as a means for safeguarding dignity. Theological scholars coming from a distinct perspective of Christian ethics have criticized this modern aversion to pain, arguing instead that in the wake of the example of Jesus, human beings are mutually communed, and that suffering is a logical consequence of such interdependency and shared desires. Suffering, therefore, should not be regarded as an unwanted accident in life, but rather as an essential part of it. However, it would appear that according to this observation, such claims merely serve to underscore the dominant aversive view of publicly displayed pain and suffering in the arena of modern living. This tenor of the time translates the mitigation of pain into modern credos and codes such as psychoanalysis and other languages of talking sense into patently senseless anguish. These social devices ensure the containment of undesirable pain at all conceivable or inconceivable cost. This move is communicated by a language that replaces instinctive sensorial reaction with culturally set rationalizing articulation. Such language is embedded in cosmological precepts, denying the capacity of culture to contend with the category that philosopher Charles Peirce calls radical otherness, of which pain could be a terrorizing example of barbaric incommunicability. As anthropologist Valentine Daniel, a student of political violence, observes, quote, pain too has a present, immediate, uncategorized, and pre-reflective aspect to it. But this firstness of pain is overwhelmed by what Peirce calls secondness, the experience of our radical otherness in which ego and non-ego are precipitated out against each other in unique and absolute opposition. Thirdness in Peirce's phenomenological category of mediation, mainly through language and culture. It is in thirdness that semiosis resumes its continuity, its movement. Thirdness is the domain of meaning. That thirdness is indeed the foundation of culture and a reflection of its intolerance to extra-cultural experiences of firstness, such as intractable pain, thus turning a dualistic or a holistic subject into a self-absorbed monadic body whose entire being is seized and possessed by the consuming totality of the seamless signal of pain. For that signal to become a sign, namely a unit of shared signification, the intervention and mediation of cultural knowledge is needed to undo that oxymoronic sensation of an unshareable universal, as coined by sociologist Arthur Frank, who himself was severely afflicted by chronic pain all his life. Releasing pain from the holds of this kind of self-absorbing solipsism sometimes submerges it into a discourse of joint, albeit not collective, suffering, which Albert Schweitzer phrased as the brotherhood or fellowship of those who bear the mark of pain. The members of this fellowship are those who have learned by similar experiences that physical pain and bodily anguish also mean a quest for relief within a conjoined project of cooperative deliverance. Such assumed fellowship or brotherhood based on a common cause of seeking relief reverts the monadic body into a dualistic agency capable of hybridization, of associating with others in pursuit of succor. This form of forming collaboration and communication is geared towards satisfying a corporeal need rather than fulfilling a mental desire. This present-bound atemporal moment of relief, of an end justified by means, might in turn become a transcendental mission. However, for now, it should be noted that the turning point between the irreducible subjectivity of pain and the social relatedness forged to collectively dispel it sets the first step on the road of waiving the authenticity of the unquestionable yet incommunicable truism of the inseparability of having pain and knowing it at once. Indeed, upon proclamation of pain as embodied cultural knowledge, a wedge is driven between known and knower, to the extent that the very act of expressing pain renders it social rather than personal, hence constructible and construable, negotiable and comprehensible. This shift from the component of the self that sociologist George Herbert Mead termed I, namely the spontaneous, inner, creative, subjective, and autonomous, to the me, the organized attitudes of others that make up the social, forfeits the former to the conditionally contingent discourse of the other. Thus, the veracity of pain is appreciated and validated in terms of its applicability to the pragmatics of social language. as a sense maker of the world. In other words, pain is only acknowledged and recognized as a cultural sign, or it is nothing, a socially inaudible cry. Notwithstanding the Wittgensteinian rudiments of such observation, it raises the issue of those claims for pain unsubstantiated and qualified by the assumed juggling between the I and the me, artless experience and socially fashioned dignity. The communally uncharted cry, scream, mourn, or groan, when unexpectedly emitted and heard, unleashes the speechless barbarian I that threatens to undermine the forfeited domain of the hearer's verbalized me. Subsequently, this me is robbed of its predictable capacity to regulate the appropriate practices by which a socially endorsed interpretation of pain is negotiated. Unless such barbarism is contained and quarantined in designated precincts, it risks a confrontation with certain human conditions deemed insufferable. The state of the terminally sick, whose pain is perceived as unending, liable to increase, apparently meaningless and totally preoccupying, is one manifestation of pain confined to the extracultural present-bound terms of modern secularization. The unwanted surge of immediate, unintended, and unintentional subjectivity incarnated in pain lays bare the blurred boundaries between humanity and inhumanity. Between humanity and inhumanity. The dignified and the undignified, that twilight zone that once again throws into relief the working of the anthropological machine, a concept formulated by philosopher Giorgio Agamben to refer to the culturally engineered anthropological mechanism that throws into relief the open gap between humanity and inhumanity. Under certain political circumstances, the working of that apparatus is perfected in practices of desubjectization by abolishing the dualistic or holistic trope of the self in favor of a bodily centered monadic mode from which pain as a signal of pronounced authenticity is expunged. The extermination camp and its corporeally inflicted horrors is an arena where the victim's painful subjectivity together with her or his dignity was eliminated from the cosmology of perpetrators, as well as from the self-effaced presence of its ultimate apparition, the Muslim. This form of bare life existence subjects those consigned to such extracultural categories to a state of being socially doomed to be killed at will without any solace of serving as a dignified sacrificial offering. These classes of people denied of any cultural ethical protection could be identified by the social inaudibility of the sound of blatantly produced, albeit reticent pain. One such case is the category of the old, whose absent presence renders their pain socially mute and symbolically insignificant. Subsequently, as pain is no longer presented as trappings of dignity, its unbribable elicitation could only testify to one's social integrity. This extracultural standpoint abandons the social call for dignity for the subjective exigency of accomplishing self-integrity. Thus, the indignity of socially expressed pain is inverted to serve the integrity of a self-sufficient subjectivity. This split places the two concepts as diametrically opposed to each other, if not mutually exclusive, with the former, dignity, being an emergent property of what Elias calls sociogenesis, while the latter, integrity, stems from what he dubs psychogenesis. Dignity, therefore, means the active suppression of the latter for sustaining the predominance of the former. The diverse forking paths of pain management attest to the need to critically revisit dignity as a default concept for accounting for essential socially sanctioned morality. In fact, the double language of omission or emission, silence or utterance, spells an existential choice between submitting to the coercive social under the guise of dignity, or else entering the free spirit of autonomous integrity under no mask whatsoever. The imposed freedom of being exiled to the apparent extra-cultural, the uncultivated land of exclusion, might sprout an opportunity for making that choice. Dignified painlessness, therefore, remains an option reserved for those whose subjugation and or commitment to cultural dictates is uncompromisingly total, uncritical and non-reflective. Thus, the fading of the mark of pain spells the waning of one of the marks of the secular ethos of modernity, the sovereign subject. Notwithstanding the complexity and ambiguity of the subject of subjectivity, this proposition could crack yet another chink in the armor of the Foucauldian materialistic view of the discursive antecedents of modern subjectivity and pain. Thus, expressed pain could serve not only as an indicator of the distinction between dualistic or holistic order on the one hand and a monistic social structure on the other, but also as a watershed moment for the emergence of a personally constituted subjectivity rather than a socially crafted illusion of independent agency. Thank you.
Why does society have a collective desire to eradicate pain? We might think that it's because pain is something we are all instinctively averse to, because we have deemed unnecessary pain an evil in its own right that can be eradicated, or because, as tacit utilitarians, we identify the good as increasing the ratio of pleasure to pain. However, Haim, if I'm understanding correctly, suggests that it is actually because the expression of pain ruptures the social. It breaks down the sedimentation of civilizing processes in which the body is brought under control and regimented, in which dignified selfhood, being in the world of socially mediated reflexivity, takes over from a being in the world that is undignified, primitive, yet integrated, embodied experience. Pain is socially tractable when it can be interpreted, when it is saying something, and can thus be rationalized through medical or psychological discourses. What is my pain saying about my body or my psyche, and what can be done about it? Even if it cannot be eliminated, it can be spoken of, listened to, and validated. These acts of interpretation translate pain from the realm of bare private sensation and bestow it with a social ontology. The socially tractable pain exists in a web of meaning that necessarily mediates the bearer's own experience, trading a form of monadic integrity for social dignity. Haim points out that these two kinds of pain are socially intractable and are therefore excluded from culture. First is pain that is all-consuming, to the extent that it leaves no space for social mediation and the construction of meaning. Such pain eradicates the social self, atavistically returning the bearer to the state of monadic bodily existence. The second kind of pain that is socially intractable is not necessarily experienced by the bearer as utterly totalizing, but it occurs in a context of meaninglessness, the cruelly imposed meaningless torture of the desubjectified person, and the meaninglessness tacitly projected onto terminal illness and old age. So that's enough of my less elegant restatement of what Haim wrote. And I'll move on to the questions that I think his analysis of pain raises by showing pain as being in opposition to the modern construction of the social. What does that tell us about moral subjects and moral communities? Who is included and who is excluded? Haim's analysis underscores the degree to which the inclusion of adults in the modern community of moral subjects tends to be predicated on their ability to self-regulate their bodies and the performance of the dignified, discursively coherent self. Those who cannot are in some cases can still be held within moral communities by others, but often they fall out and are relegated to spaces outside of culture. This is true not only of those in totalizing pain who have lost their social selfhood and the old and dying who are hidden away, but those whose developmental disabilities seem to preclude the necessary degree of reflexivity that allows the shift from the spontaneous I that Haim mentioned to the social me, or those whose mental or physical disabilities render them undignified because they cannot control their bodies, navigate themselves through the world without assistance, or communicate verbally, as well as those with dementia who often lose both the discursive self and bodily control. The tyranny of dignity that Haim calls out, the opposition of society to accommodating spontaneous monadic bodily existence, to appreciate its integrity on its own terms, is reflected across cultural spaces and even within the non-spaces to which it is relegated, such as the medical system, in which it is meant to be addressed. This necessitates a formalization of the ethical because one member of the moral social dyad has lost standing. To quote from Robert Burt, rules governing doctor-patient relations must rest on the premise that anyone's wish to help a desperately pained, apparently helpless person is intertwined with a wish to hurt that person, to obliterate him from sight. How else to respond in a civilized manner to such tacit demands than by expressing a desire to exit the world with dignity? The question is whether these trends, by bringing the tyranny of dignity to its logical conclusion, create space for resistance, what Haim calls asocial integrity. And here perhaps we can look at precedents in second-wave feminism and the disability rights movement. The tyranny of dignity that tried to rescue childbirth from the realm of barbaric pain and loss of bodily control through twilight sleep, the epidural, and now routine cesarean section, created space for a feminist counter-movement that sought to reclaim the integrity of the experience. At the same time, at the theoretical level, it contributed to a critique of what feminist theorists call normative dualism, the belief that what is important about a person is a certain set of rational capacities. Similarly, the disability rights movement has not merely been concerned with placing the disabled on equal juridical footing, but to validate the subjectivity of existence that does not conform to ableist norms. It has succeeded in the former far more than in the latter. This is obviously a movement still in progress. Similarly, will the tyranny of dignity that seems to be ushering in the possibility of routine euthanasia in turn create space for the counter-movement that allows the liberty of integrated existence in pain to abide within the bounds of culture?
Thank you.
Can I just
Yeah.
make one comment
Sure.
to Ari? I couldn't put it better myself. Thank you.
Yes, please. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with Meg, so we're just gonna have to point.
I really enjoyed reading the paper, and it made me think about the whole anthropological difficulty in sickness cross-culturally. So, as you all know, anthropology makes very few claims about universal, but one of the few would be that if we study sickness cross-culturally, one of the few things that connects them all is both a dispensation and an obligation to recede from normal social public duties. And so it made me think of how pain fits with this. In a sense, pain doesn't necessarily come with the same obligations and duties. It seems that it's sickness without this special liminal category. So I was wondering, had you thought about it in comparison to the anthropological category of sickness?
Okay, well done. You're absolutely right. I think it's a damn shame that anthropological research is so deficient in literature on human universals. There is Brown and others, but very few and far between. And I think the study of pain can contribute a great deal towards it.
Okay. Yes, please. This is illuminating because it kind of releases us to
So just picking up from that, I mean, I would contest that pain is a special category of illness. I think any catastrophic illness would result in a similar kind of social isolation. But I have a question, perhaps, if for both of you, relating to your both your points. If pain in a certain sense can be represented as a rupture of the social, can't I invert that, flip it, and say no, and chiming with Schweitzer perhaps and bringing up Levinas and saying perhaps the only purpose of pain in the secular age, or ever, maybe, was the demand for a call to response, so that in the presence of the cry of pain, as Levinas writes in On Suffering, is the implicit call to the other for response, for care. Perhaps that is the purpose of pain in the secular age. So rather than a rupture of the social, it's actually all about the social. Maybe it's the other way around.
I mean, pain is a means of communication at any rate. I mean, it is always the purpose of pain or expressing pain to communicate. And I wonder about that. I mean, this is a moot point. We don't really know. For example, if somebody stabs you in the back without you noticing, without you being prepared for it, how would you react? I suppose you would emit a cry of pain if it's painful enough. There's no communication about that at all, or maybe there is, I don't know. But I think pain is accorded with that status of being completely spontaneous and self-expressive in the sense that it doesn't really, that communication, it's only its second order, not first order. But as I said, it's questionable.
Yeah. I mean, I also wonder if for Levinas, the totalizing pain still constitutes a loss of self, so that he then puts all of the burden on the other to retain the person in the moral community, and so that would be true if we had responded in such a way, but we, as Clyde points out, we tend not to.
For sure, I mean, in that essay, he definitely does isolate out the absolute extremity of pain, intolerable lumbagos, and he names a few pain conditions that wouldn't fall into that social function, but those are so few, and to focus upon that absolute extremity of pain is to kind of paint pain as this awful monster that rampages through, whereas I think the degree of pain is most often that
high. Okay.
I feel the need at this point in this conference on pain to bring our attention to pleasure, maybe as a bit of a balance or corrective. And it seems to me there's some things that are being said about pain that could equally be said about extreme forms of pleasure, orgasmic cries that seem once again to bring kind of the primeval to the surface and break with the social order. And in that sense constitute kind of a threat that a society needs to either close down or assimilate. And so I'm wondering in what ways some aspects of the discussion of pain are symmetrical with or genuinely asymmetrical with paying attention to extreme states of pleasure.
Well, I think you might say that they belong to the same category of sensory, of unmediated sensory expression of what the body feels, what the body senses. I'm not sure to what extent they could be actually divided. I'm not really sure. If you look at babies, for example, I think there is no real distinction between their cries of pleasure and their cries of pain. And as a parent, of course, you would discern between the two. But for the stranger listener, there might be no difference between them. I can't say anything else about it, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for the beautiful talk. I'd like to suggest, in a continuation to what you're saying, and response, Shane, also to your question, that I think that the importance of pain, and this is why the defense of pain is so important, is that on the one hand we feel that it invades us, right? That it is this strange other, the utter otherness. On the other hand, what it does is expose structures, social, subjective, linguistic structures that exist before it, prior to it. So, for instance, the problem of other minds in philosophical language would be the unbridgeable divide between me and others is something that I experience every day, but not in the same way that I experience it when I'm in extreme pain. And the case of language is even more interesting because this famous problem of the inherent inexpressibility, incommunicability of pain, etc., is something that is actually true to most of our expressions in language, but we don't really feel it because we have, a social agreement that helps us to understand one another. But pain exposes problems and problematic structures that are pre-existent, and it has to do with the way that you describe this threat that pain poses to society. So when something is so scary and threatening, then it must be important in some way.
Maybe pain is different to other forms of expression that are muffled by language in as much as pain calls for relief. I mean, you want relief and you want communication to accomplish that relief, but communication is not available because of the incommunicability of pain.
Guy?
Haim, thank you very much. And on Mondays and Thursdays I'd agree, but today's a Tuesday. So my question is this: is pain first and culture third, or is culture first and pain third? And let me explain, or second. So, there are two ways of thinking. For example, let's take something different, noise. Okay, you can say first we hear noise, and then sometimes we can make sense of it, sometimes it remains noise. An alternative approach is to say we never hear noise initially. We always hear something. We think we capture something that is it the train, is it the cattle, whatever, something's going on, and then sometimes we can make sense of it, but that comes later. But the first and immediate response is actually to try and make sense. And so it's not that I don't agree with you that sometimes pain breaks our cultural signification systems, but I'm not sure that it does it in a primary way. And the reason why this is important, because this opens the possibility that when this happens, when pain breaks our cultural communications and signification systems, it may happen each time, not in a universal way, but each time in a specific way. So as Tolstoy famously says, all happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So that when we have this breaking of the system of signification, we're not back to a first primary foundational universal, but rather we break to different forms of senselessness.
Let me answer you with Tolstoy. The death of Ivan Ilyich. Ivan Ilyich feels strange pains, awful pains, debilitating pains. He can't make sense of them. Making sense is his project, that project fails. And that's my argument, more or less.
Asaf?
Thank you. So thanks again for a really fascinating talk. I was wondering about joining some parts of the paper regarding the morality of voluntarily joining the brotherhood of pain. Because we talked at first about masochism being perceived as a deviation or even unmoral, either religious or from a secular point of view. But if we think about the nobility of the brotherhood of pain and also reading the text from the people, the person at the Jewish daycare who tells how the pain actually made him a better man, a fuller man, more aware. So I was wondering why can't we see joining this brotherhood of pain as maybe altruistic or even self-fulfilling, not an obligation, but maybe a virtue, either to help the other people in this brotherhood as a joiner, or even for a personal cause, like being a better man, being more stronger, almost even like an athlete to rupture his body every time and the pain in order to get stronger and better. So how do you think about the morality of voluntary pain?
Claim that their main purpose in life as a collective community was to help each other, to relieve not only pain, but other matters of distress, such economic need or deprivation of family relationship, and so on and so forth. And I couldn't agree with you more, you're right.
I have a question. So, a little bit similar to what Shai asked, if pain could be separated from the social, is there this intrinsic pain without the social context? I wanted to ask about maybe the psychological, and I think that pain and anger, pain and fear, pain and pleasure, I think that it's not pain or pleasure. It could be pain and pleasure. Pain and humiliation could be the same pain in the physiological sense, but in terms of the personal experience, it's contextual not only by way of social, but also by way of emotional, which of course too is cultural in a sense, obviously, but can we make sense of it without looking at the emotional context that accompanies pain?
Yeah, I think that if we go by Lakoff and Johnson, metaphors we live by, then we have to assume that the pain is a result of metaphor and not the other way around. And you can rest your case.
Okay. I'm good at doing that. Any more? Yeah. No.
Well, thank you. Just a comment or a question. Media, in certain aspects of it, is fascinated with pain in a very particular way. Pain, together with other primary affects like disgust, is sometimes used as a signal for truthfulness, the truthfulness of an image. It is real because it is painful, it is real because it is disgusting, and I'm sure it can be related to your argument, but I'm wondering whether it supports your interpretation or Shai's interpretation.
Of course it supports my interpretation. As I stated in my paper, I mean, I've got it in writing, that pain signals authenticity, and authenticity is truism. And truism is part of your inner selfhood, and that inner selfhood is integrity, what I called integrity. That's why I opposed integrity to dignity, because dignity is social, integrity is completely personal.
Yeah, particularly in the media.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much again.